Born wolfless, Lira is the shame of her alpha-blooded family. She carries the weight of a void where her wolf should be, despised for a weakness she cannot control. Her father, Alpha Toran, sees only a failure in her, a reminder of the imperfections in his bloodline. To him, Lira is a tool to be discarded, her fate sealed to be sold as a bride to a cruel elderly alpha from the Blackwater Pack. She is nothing but a burden, a pawn in the endless game of pack politics. The great hall of the Ashwood Pack smells of roasted meat, spilled ale, and festering resentment. Lira moves along the shadows, carrying a tray weighed down with tankards, her bare feet cold against the stone floor. Each step is heavy with the knowledge that she will never be more than this, the servant, the outcast. At the high table, her family feasts, her father, Alpha Toran, presides with the cold authority of a ruler who sees only power, not family. Beside him sits Caden, her brother, his bored eyes never once meeting hers, his broad shoulders poised to lead. He is everything Lira is not, strong, powerful, alpha-blooded, destined for greatness while she remains forgotten. Lyra's existence is a quiet rebellion. She serves in silence, but there is fire in her burning quietly beneath the surface. It's this fire that has always kept her spirit unbroken, despite the cruelty she faces. But she knows that soon her fate will be sealed in the form of an arranged marriage to Alpha Toran, an old brute from the Blackwater Pack. She will be nothing more than a tool to cement her family's power. But just as the weight of her fate closes in, the ground trembles beneath her. The Iron King, King Aric, arrives. The Lycan king does not look at the Ashwood Pack's warriors, nor does he see the family's prized bloodlines. His gaze lands on Lira, the rejected Omega. Where her family sees shame, King Aric sees strength. And in a move that shatters all protocol, he points to Lira, the very daughter her family had hoped to erase, and declares, "She is mine." Lyra's world shatters. Her family's protests fall on deaf ears. Alpha Toran's power is nothing in the face of the Iron King's will. King Aric's cold, calculated eyes never leave Lira as he claims her, sweeping her from the pack's halls and into a future that is anything but certain. If you believe that everyone deserves to be treated with respect, hit subscribe. Don't side with bullies like Alpha Toran who think they can just discard those who don't meet their standards. Only the true champions of justice will stand with Lira. If you're tired of seeing the weak mistreated, drop a comment saying, "I stand for strength." King Aric's cold, calculated eyes never leave Lira as he claims her, sweeping her from the pack's halls and into a future that is anything but certain. The weight of his gaze presses down on her like a storm cloud, too heavy to escape, yet undeniably compelling. The great hall of the Ashwood Pack, with its smells of stale ale and roasted meat, fades into the distance as Lira is ushered away, leaving behind the family who had never truly seen her. As she is dragged from her past, she cannot shake the feeling that she is being led to her end. The echoes of her father's dismissive voice ring in her ears, the cruel words hanging in the air long after they are spoken. "You will be gone tomorrow. You will serve a purpose even if you never find your wolf." For Lira, the word purpose rings hollow. It is a promise made by a father who has no love for his own daughter, a promise she knows will be fulfilled in the cold, unforgiving hands of Alpha Toran. The old Alpha from the Blackwater Pack is everything she fears, a brutal man whose reputation precedes him. His name is whispered in hushed tones in every corner of the territories, a wolf who has buried 3 wives. Her mother had once told her that Alpha Toran's previous mates had been swallowed by his cruelty, their lives extinguished like candles in a windstorm. Lyra's heart hammers in her chest as she imagines the fate awaiting her. She will be nothing more than a possession, sold like cattle, given no more respect than the fur of a dead animal. She is the bargaining chip, the prize traded for weapons for an alliance that holds no regard for her desires or her spirit. It is a fate worse than death. Her only hope is that this is a nightmare she will wake from. But as King Aric's grip tightens on her, her pulse quickening with every step, she knows that this is not a dream. She is leaving her home, her pack, and everything she once knew. The Iron King has taken everything she had, and there is nothing left but the uncertain future he offers. The journey from Ashwood is a blur of cold wind and empty landscapes. Lira is placed on a horse bound by the reins with no room to move. The cold bites into her skin, and her body aches from the harsh ride, but it is nothing compared to the gnawing fear that settles deep in her bones. Every step she takes away from the Ashwood Pack feels like a step toward her doom, and yet there is something else in her, a flicker of hope, however faint, that maybe, just maybe, this new world could offer something more than the life of a forgotten Omega. She dares not look back at the pack hall, where the blood of her ancestors still lingers in the walls. The pack that once called itself family, that treated her like a shadow, now feels like a distant memory, a dream fading as the fog rolls in. She glances sideways at the men who accompany her, the black-clad warriors of King Aric's guard. Their faces are impassive, their eyes hard with training, and yet there is something about them that feels different. They do not look at her as though she is worthless, they look at her as though she is important. But importance to them is not the same as freedom. They stop when the sun dips below the horizon, say, a red stain bleeding into the night sky. The camp is set quickly, and the warriors take their positions, forming a perimeter that keeps Lyra feeling like a caged animal. King Aric speaks little, his words few but sharp, commanding the world around him with quiet power. Lyra, still bound to her horse, watches him from afar, her stomach twisted in knots. The sight of him, the terrifying Iron King, haunts her dreams. His presence feels like a distant thunderstorm, a force that waits to strike. There is no softness in his eyes, no warmth in his voice. He is a king, strong, powerful, ruthless. As the fire crackles and the night deepens, Lyra's thoughts wander back to the Ashwood pack, to the life she once knew. There had been moments of fleeting warmth, small things that had given her hope. The glances from her mother that held some semblance of affection, even though it was buried beneath layers of disappointment. Her father, Alpha Toran, had always been distant, but there had been times when he would watch her from across the room, his eyes studying her as if he was trying to figure out where he went wrong. And then there was Caden, her brother, the one who never even bothered to look at her. He had been the heir, the future of the pack, and she had been a stain on the bloodline, a reminder that not every wolf in their family was worthy. He had tormented her, mocked her, as if to drive the point home that she was less than him, less than anyone else. The weight of her family's rejection presses down on her chest like a stone, making it difficult to breathe. But as the firelight flickers in front of her, Lyra forces herself to focus on the present. She cannot change her past, the only thing she can control is the future. Suddenly, a voice breaks the silence. "You will be sold tomorrow, it's a good deal." Lyra looks up to find one of the warriors standing nearby, his eyes scanning her for any sign of fear. He has the face of a man who has seen too much, a face that says he has lived his entire life at the mercy of the king. She doesn't speak at first, but the warrior continues. "Alpha Toran's bride," he mutters. "He'll make sure you are treated well, at least for a while." The words twist in Lyra's stomach. Treated well, she thinks. Alpha Toran's kindness, she knows, is a fleeting thing. His temper, however, is not. She shudders, trying to block out the images of what she's about to face. And yet, as the warrior's words echo in her mind, a deeper voice breaks through the darkened quiet, a voice that shakes the very ground beneath her. "No, she is mine." King Aric's voice is like a blade slicing through the night air, cold and sharp. Lyra looks up, startled, as the king steps from the shadows, his figure looming like a storm. His gaze locks onto hers, unwavering, intense. "She is not yours to sell, to trade, or to give away," he says, his voice carrying the weight of a king's command. His eyes never leave Lyra's as he approaches, his stride measured, deliberate. There is no fear in him, only the cold certainty of a ruler who has always gotten what he wanted. Lyra feels her heart race in her chest. He is talking about me, she thinks, her mind spinning. He is taking me away from them. He is taking me away from the life I was meant to live. Aric stops before her, his towering presence casting a shadow that swallows her whole. He reaches out, taking her by the arm, not roughly, but with an undeniable strength that makes her feel small in comparison. His touch sends a shiver down her spine, not from fear, but from something else, something unfamiliar. "You belong to me now," he says again, his voice low yet commanding, "and I will not let anyone take you from me." Lyra is caught between the man who has taken everything from her and the king who now claims her. The future she thought she understood is no longer certain. The nightmare she had feared, of becoming a bride to an old, cruel alpha, has been replaced by something far more terrifying. And yet, in the depth of her heart, she feels a flicker of something else. A strange, almost dizzying sensation that, for the first time in her life, she is seen for who she truly is. Her mind races. What does this mean, she wonders? What does King Aric want with me? As the camp settles for the night, Lyra lies awake, her thoughts a whirlwind of confusion. The Iron King has claimed her, but what does that truly mean for her future? And what price will she have to pay for the power he wields so effortlessly? One thing is certain, the life she had known is gone. And a new chapter, darker and more dangerous, has begun. The The morning sun barely pierced the gray sky, casting the Ashwood Pack's lands in hues of purple and dull gray, as though even the heavens themselves were mourning. It was the day of Lyra's departure, the day she would be handed over to Alpha Toran of the Blackwater Pack, a cruel man whose name alone made her blood run cold. But in the midst of the preparations for her grim fate, the pack's usual routine was shattered. There was no familiar buzz of morning activity, no children running through the halls, no laughter. Instead, there was a silence so deep it almost felt like the world had stopped spinning. The air, thick with tension, carried an unfamiliar scent, one that Lyra could not identify but instinctively recognized as a harbinger of danger. Something was coming, something that would change everything. She lay in the small, windowless room her father had locked her in as if the door could keep her from facing the inevitable. But she could feel it, the rising fear of the pack, the fear that thrummed like a heartbeat beneath the stone walls. Whispers, frenzied and urgent, drifted through the cracks of her door, too faint to make out clearly, but enough to stir a dread she couldn't shake. A runner had arrived during the night, bearing news that shattered the fragile peace that had settled in Ashwood after years of dominance. King Aric, the Iron King, was coming. The name alone sent a shiver down her spine. The Lycan conqueror, his very presence meant destruction. King Aric didn't negotiate, he didn't come to bargain, to seek alliances, he came to conquer, to absorb. Lyra had heard the stories of how he razed entire packs to the ground, leaving nothing but ashes in his wake. The Ashwood pack, her family, was about to face its reckoning. Lyra pressed her ear to the door, straining to catch fragments of conversation. She heard it clearly now, King Aric was coming today. Her father had tried to prepare for an attack, fortifying their walls and gathering the best warriors to defend the pack. But even in her small, confined room, Lyra could feel the weight of impending doom pressing in on them all. The Ashwood pack was not preparing for a guest, they were preparing for annihilation. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat louder than the last as the reality of her situation set in. Alpha Toran's promise of a future under his cruel hand felt more like a distant memory now. In a matter of hours, that future might not matter. She might not even make it to that horrible, unthinkable marriage. Lyra clutched the thin blanket wrapped around her shoulders, her breath shallow. The runners had spoken of Aric's arrival with hushed reverence, but also with fear. They spoke of his ruthlessness, of the way he devoured weakness, and how packs that resisted were completely erased. And Ashwood, though strong in its own right, was not built to withstand the onslaught of a Lycan king. Her mind swirled with thoughts of escape, of anything but the life she had been sold into. Is there any chance, she wondered, her hands trembling? But then she shook her head. The reality of her situation was too much. There was no escape. She was a prisoner. Whether to Alpha Toran or to King Aric, it made little difference. The moment stretched out in silence, the stillness of her room contrasting with the frenzy outside. But then, the unmistakable sound of a horn sliced through the heavy air. It was a deep, mournful note echoing through the trees, announcing the arrival of something monumental. King Aric was here. Lyra's heart lurched in her chest as she heard the sounds of feet marching, of voices whispering in hushed tones, frantic preparations echoing through the pack. She was not allowed to leave her room, not allowed to witness the chaos that was unfolding in the pack's courtyard. But she could hear it, the heavy tread of boots on the stone floors, the sharp commands, the fear in her mother's voice as she told Lyra's siblings to stay inside. The scent of dread was thick in the air, and it made Lyra's stomach churn. Minutes passed, though they felt like hours, before the door to her room was flung open. She stood there, heart racing, as one of the pack's guards entered, his face pale and grim. "Come," the guard said curtly, his tone devoid of emotion. "King Aric has arrived. Your father demands you stand before him. He will see you." Lyra felt her stomach drop. She hadn't expected this. She had assumed that she would be left to sit in her room, awaiting her fate. But now, the reality of facing the king was upon her. What did he want with her? The thought of being in his presence was overwhelming. What did he see when he looked at her? A prize, a possession, or was she simply another tool in his conquest? Without waiting for a response, the guard stepped forward and roughly gripped her arm, pulling her along as she stumbled behind him. The cold stone corridors of the Ashwood Pack's halls stretched out before her, each step echoing in the silence, but it was a different silence now, one filled with dread. When they reached the great hall, the sight that greeted her made her breath catch in her throat. The hall was packed, filled with warriors, betas,
and Alphas, all standing rigidly at attention, their eyes fixed on the entrance. It was like a room full of statues, all frozen in place by fear, and at the center, in the farthest seat at the high table, sat King Aric. Lyra's eyes were drawn to him immediately. He was unlike anyone she had ever seen. Tall, imposing, his presence overwhelming the entire room. His storm-gray eyes were fixed on the crowd before him, his expression unreadable. He wore dark leather armor, the faintest hint of blood staining the edges, but it was his stillness that held Lyra's attention. There was a quiet intensity in him, a dangerous calm that made him appear like a force of nature, untouchable and inevitable. Her father stood nearby, his back straight, his face tight with something Lyra could not read. He had been trying to mask his fear, trying to put on the front of a leader, but Lyra saw the crack in his mask. He was terrified. The Ashwood pack had no idea how to deal with a Lycan king. And then, King Aric's eyes locked onto Lyra's. She felt a jolt in her chest, a shiver running down her spine. His gaze was piercing, calculating, and she felt as though he could see every part of her, the fear, the shame, the pain. He saw through her layers, and it unsettled her more than she cared to admit. For a long moment, Aric simply stared at her, his gaze unyielding, studying her like a piece of art, or perhaps an object to be weighed. It was unnerving. His gaze was neither kind nor cruel, it simply was as though he was sizing up his next conquest. And then, in one smooth, effortless motion, he stood. The room fell completely silent, every single person in the hall holding their breath. His steps were purposeful, measured, like the inevitable march of a storm. He reached her in a few strides, his eyes never leaving hers. There was something dark and predatory in his gaze, but also something that made Lyra feel alive. Something raw, something fierce. He was not a man who hid his intentions, and yet, the longer he stood before her, the more she wondered, what does he want with me? Step forward. Aric's voice was low, deep, and commanding. It sent a chill through Lyra, one that settled deep in her bones. She hesitated for only a moment before stepping forward, her legs unsteady, her heart racing. She was caught between fear and curiosity, between the terror of facing the unknown and the strange allure of his presence. As she neared him, Aric's eyes never wavered from her face. The intensity of his gaze was suffocating, and yet she could not bring herself to look away. He reached out, his hand brushing against her arm, not in violence, but in a possessive, almost calculated way, as if claiming her, marking her as his. The room was still, not a single person moved, but Lyra could feel their eyes on her. Whispers had already begun to stir in the hall, but she could not hear them. She was lost in the pull of the Iron King's gaze. "You," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to reverberate through the hall. "You are not what they say you are." Lyra's breath caught in her throat. What did he mean by that? Did he think she was more than the wolfless daughter her father had discarded? His hand lingered on her arm for a moment longer, his touch cool but firm. "I see it in you," he said, almost as if to himself. "You are not a burden, you are not a tool." Lyra's heart beat louder in her chest. For the first time in her life, she felt seen, not for what she lacked, but for what she could be. But it was also terrifying. What was King Aric trying to tell her? What did he see when he looked at her? Before she could formulate any response, he turned to face her father, his eyes colder than before. "I have no need for what you offer, Toran," Aric said, his voice chillingly calm. "I have already claimed what I need." Her father's face contorted with confusion and something else, something close to desperation. "But," Aric cut him off with a single dismissive gesture. "You are weak, and your pack is weak. That is why I take what is mine, not because I need it, but because I can." Her father's face turned pale, his mouth opening and closing as though he had no words left. It was clear that the world he had built, the world where he was in control, was crumbling before his eyes. Lyra was no longer just the daughter of Alpha Toran. She was something else now. Whether she was ready or not, she was about to face a future under the Iron King's rule. The ride from the Ashwood Pack's territory to the Iron Citadel was long and grueling. Every hour, every mile felt like a stretch of time Lyra would never get back. Her body was bruised from the rough handling, her hands bound to the saddle, and her thoughts tangled in confusion. Her heart, still racing from the events that had unfolded, could barely settle. Lyra's mind replayed everything she had witnessed, the cruelty of her father, the shock of King Aric's sudden arrival, and the chilling way he claimed her as his own. The image of the Iron King's cold, unyielding eyes burned in her memory. What was he to her? She still had no answers. The landscape stretched out endlessly before her.
The mountains loomed like giants, their peaks shrouded in a mist that seemed as cold and unfeeling as the Lycan king himself. The journey was one of silence. The warriors who escorted her showed no interest in her, their expressions hard and unreadable. The only sound, besides the steady beat of hooves, was the wind, howling, biting, indifferent. As the day wore on, fatigue and cold began to wear at Lyra's spirit. Her once bright hope, ignited by King Aric's strange claims, started to flicker. She had been taken from everything she knew, her pack, her family, and her past. What was left for her in the Iron Citadel? What was King Aric's true plan? Was she truly as important to him as he had claimed, or was she just another pawn in his game of conquest? Finally, as the sun began to set, they reached the base of a jagged mountain range. The towering peaks, sharp and unforgiving, seemed to swallow up the sky. The air grew thinner, colder, and Lyra felt herself shivering despite the layers of clothing she wore. She could feel the change in the atmosphere, as if they were entering a place far removed from the world she had known. The citadel stood at the peak of one of these towering mountains, an imposing fortress of black stone and iron. The walls were high, carved with intricate runes and patterns that seemed both ancient and powerful. A heavy gate, more like a wall of iron than a door, loomed in front of them, guarded by soldiers who bore the Lycan king's insignia. They moved with the precision of a well-oiled machine, their eyes sharp, their movements deadly. Lyra felt a cold shiver crawl down her spine as they approached the gates. The Iron Citadel was unlike anything she had ever seen. Its sheer scale and presence were enough to crush a person's spirit. She had no choice but to enter, to move forward into the unknown, but something about the place felt wrong. A heaviness in the air, a sense that no one who entered ever truly left the same. The gates creaked open with an eerie groan, revealing the dark stone halls beyond. As they passed through, Lyra was struck by the silence of the place. It wasn't the quiet of peace, but of something darker, something cold and oppressive. Once inside, she was led through a series of twisting corridors, their stone walls adorned with the faintest traces of red, perhaps bloodstains or something older. The air was thick, filled with the smell of dampness and iron. It felt like a place where no warmth ever touched, no light ever shined. The warriors stopped in front of a large, ornate door. It was decorated with gold filigree and runes, a stark contrast to the grim surroundings. One of the warriors stepped forward, giving Lyra a sharp look before knocking 3 times. A deep voice responded from within the room. "Enter." The door swung open, revealing a massive chamber that could only be described as the throne room of a king. A high, black stone throne sat at the far end of the room, draped in dark furs and heavy cloth. The throne's design was stark and foreboding, built for power, not comfort. But what drew Lyra's attention most was the man seated upon it. King Aric. He sat there, a colossal figure, as if the throne were made for him alone. His eyes, storm gray and cold as the mountains themselves, were fixed on her as she entered. There was no warmth in his gaze, only a calculation, a predatory stillness that made her feel like she was prey in a hunter's sights. His expression never changed as she was led forward, her feet barely touching the ground, her pulse racing. She felt as though she were walking into the heart of a storm, where every step brought her closer to something she could not control. He spoke, his voice low and steady. "Leave us." The warriors turned and left the room without hesitation, closing the door behind them. The silence that followed felt suffocating, as if the room itself were holding its breath. King Aric's gaze remained locked on Lyra, unwavering. He said nothing at first, simply watching her as if waiting for her to speak. Lyra could feel her breath catch in her throat. The enormity of her situation was impossible to escape. She was in the presence of a king, no, a conqueror whose very existence commanded fear and respect. His power was undeniable, and yet there was something else in his eyes. A spark, an intensity that made her wonder if he saw her as more than just a tool. What does he want from me, she thought, but the question stayed in her mind. She could not speak it aloud. Finally, King Aric's voice broke the silence. "You were claimed by me, not as a prize, but as something else." Lyra's heart skipped a beat. Something else, like she thought? What does that mean? Aric stood from the throne, his presence dwarfing hers. He moved toward her with purpose, each step measured like the movement of a predator closing in on its prey. But there was no aggression in his movements, only a cold precision. He stopped just before her, his storm-gray eyes examining her with an intensity that made her feel bare before him. "You are not a possession," he said, his voice low but strong. "You are something different, Lyra." His words struck her with a force she hadn't expected. Lyra, her name. It sounded different when he said it, commanding, almost like an order, but also with a strange reverence that she couldn't understand. I don't understand, she whispered, her voice barely audible. She had no idea what he meant by his words, no understanding of why he had chosen her. She wasn't important to him, was she? Aric didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached out, his fingers brushing against her cheek in a motion that was too gentle to be a threat, but still carried the weight of his power. His touch sent a shiver through her body, something electric, something raw. You will learn, he said softly, almost as if to himself. Then, in a sudden shift, his demeanor changed. He stepped back, his eyes now cold again, the ruler back in control. You will remain here, in my citadel. I will teach you how to survive this world, how to become something more than you are now. If you wish to stay alive, that is. His words hung in the air, a threat and a promise all at once. Lyra could feel the weight of them. She wasn't just a captive here, she was part of a larger plan, one that she didn't fully understand. All she knew was that she was no longer just the rejected daughter of Ashwood. She was something else now, something he was shaping, whether she liked it or not. And as the door closed behind him, the sound of it locking in place, Lyra was left alone in the vast empty room, her mind racing. The reality of the Iron Citadel had settled over her like a blanket of cold steel. There would be no escaping this place, no going back. She was here to stay. The Iron Citadel was a fortress built not only of stone and steel, but of an ancient unspoken rule: survive or perish. The air in the Citadel was thick with that rule, suffocating anyone who dared enter its halls. Even the very ground beneath her feet seemed heavy, as if it were made to crush weakness into dust. Every stone, every shadow seemed to whisper the same cold message: survive. Lyra stood at the window of her room, staring out at the vast, unforgiving landscape below. The mountains stretched endlessly, their peaks scraping at the sky, a cold reminder of the power of the Iron King. The world outside was harsh and unyielding, much like the place she now found herself in. She had been in the Citadel for 3 days now, and each day felt like an eternity. The warriors moved around her like shadows, silent and grim. No one spoke to her. They barely acknowledged her presence, as if she were nothing more than an afterthought, a pawn in the king's grand design. Yet, she couldn't escape the feeling that she was being watched at all times. The only time she had truly interacted with King Aric was that first moment in the throne room when he claimed her and spoke cryptically of her future. Since then, he had remained distant, watching from the shadows, never explaining what he meant when he said she was something else. Lyra couldn't help but wonder what he had seen in her, what he expected from her. She wasn't the daughter of a powerful alpha, nor was she a strong wolf. She was nothing. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the heavy door to her room creaking open. A man dressed in the dark leathers of a warrior entered. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone used to power. His eyes were sharp, dark, and piercing. "Come," he said gruffly, his voice devoid of warmth. "The king has summoned you." Lyra's heart leapt in her chest. The king? Was today the day he would finally explain what her future held? Her mind raced as she followed the warrior down the cold, stone corridors of the Citadel, her heart pounding in anticipation. The place felt like a maze, and she had no idea where they were taking her. But she was too curious, too desperate for answers to care. They stopped in front of a large, arched door at the end of a long hallway. The warrior knocked twice, the sound echoing in the quiet. A deep voice from within called, "Enter." The door swung open and Lyra was ushered inside. King Aric sat on a raised platform in the center of the room, his black throne casting a long shadow on the floor. The room was dimly lit by torches along the walls, their flames flickering in the cold air. It was a room made for a king, a place where power was not just held but displayed. Aric looked up from his seat as she entered, his eyes locking onto hers. There was no warmth in them, just cold calculation. He stood and walked toward her, each step measured, as if he were studying her, as if she were a puzzle he had yet to solve. Lyra stood frozen in place, her body tense. She felt small, insignificant in his presence. The way he moved, so confident, so sure, made her feel like a shadow beside him. "You're here," Aric said, his voice low and commanding. "Good. I trust your quarters are to your satisfaction?" Lyra nodded quickly, not trusting herself to speak. She had never been one for conversation, especially with someone like him, but she was too anxious to say anything of substance. Aric seemed to notice her discomfort, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. It wasn't a kind smile, but it was something else, something darkly amused. "I trust you're still wondering what all of this means for you," he said, his voice cutting through the silence. "Why you're here, why I claimed you, am I correct?" Lira opened her mouth to speak, but the words stuck in her throat. She didn't know how to answer him. "Yes," she thought, "I need to know what you want with me." Aric continued, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You may not know it yet, but you're here because you are more than just the wolfless daughter of an alpha." He paused, as if savoring the effect his words would have on her. "You are something else, and you will learn to survive this world just as I have." The room felt even colder, and Lira swallowed hard, her hands trembling. What does he mean by that? She had no answers, but the fear gnawing at her insides told her this was not an opportunity she could ignore. Aric wasn't just keeping her here as a token, he was shaping her into something. He stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. "Today," he said, "you begin your training." Lyra's heart skipped a beat. Training? She had no idea what kind of training he was referring to, but the way he said it made her feel as though she was being prepared for something brutal. Aric moved past her, signaling for her to follow. "Come," he commanded. "You will learn to fight, not with strength, but with your mind." Her stomach turned. Fight? She wasn't a fighter. She had never been one. She had always been the weak one, the outsider, the one who couldn't keep up with the pack's demands. How could she fight? How could she ever stand a chance in a place like this? As if reading her thoughts, Aric glanced over his shoulder. "You will learn. I will teach you." Lira hesitated for a moment, then followed him, her feet dragging as she walked across the cold stone floors. They entered a large chamber at the far end of the citadel, a room filled with weapons, swords, daggers, and axes hanging on the walls, gleaming in the dim light. A heavy weight settled in Lyra's chest as she looked around the room. She was about to step into a world of violence, a world she had never known, and the thought terrified her. Aric moved to a small table in the center of the room and picked up a dagger, examining it with the same precision and focus he applied to everything. His eyes met hers, and the expression on his face was unreadable. "You are not a warrior," he said, his voice cold, "but that does not mean you cannot be dangerous." Lira nodded mutely, her mind was racing. Dangerous? How can I be dangerous? She wasn't like him, she wasn't a killer. She wasn't anything like the fierce warriors who filled the citadel. Aric placed the dagger in her hand, his grip firm and unyielding. "This," he said, "is the first step, not to kill, but to defend yourself, to survive." His eyes held hers. "If you wish to live in this world, you must learn to fight with more than just your body. You must fight with your mind, your instincts, your cunning." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. Cunning? That was all she had left. The only thing she could rely on was her mind. But how? How could she transform herself from the weak, rejected daughter into someone capable of surviving in a world like this? Aric watched her closely, waiting for her to respond. When she didn't, he stepped forward and gripped her wrist, guiding the dagger into her hand. "I will teach you," he repeated, his voice soft but insistent. "You will learn to wield this. You will learn how to fight." The silence in the room was deafening as Lira stared at the dagger in her hand, the cold steel a reminder of the path she had just set foot on. There's no turning back now, she thought. I either survive or I die. Lyra's first lesson with the dagger was nothing like she had imagined. King Aric's lessons were not gentle or encouraging, they were brutal, sharp, and relentless. Each day, he tested her resolve, pushing her past the limits she had once believed she could never surpass. The chamber was cold, its stone walls echoing with every movement as Lira stood in front of Aric. The king was silent as usual, his eyes fixed on her every movement. He wasn't just watching her, he was studying her. Waiting for her to waiting for her to show weakness. For the past week, Aric had shown her how to hold the dagger, how to position herself, and how to use the weapon to defend herself. But it wasn't enough. She had no strength, no training. She was a servant, a discarded daughter. How could she possibly become a warrior? Aric had been patient for the most part, but there was a cold expectation in his eyes. "You will learn," he'd said. But Lira wasn't sure if she could. She wasn't like the warriors of the Citadel, tall, powerful, and trained from birth. She was the opposite, weak, unwanted, and unskilled. "You're holding it wrong," Aric's voice cut through her thoughts, cold and cutting. Lyra's hand trembled as she adjusted her grip on the dagger, trying to match his posture. But it wasn't right. It never felt right. Aric stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. He didn't speak immediately, but observed her movements with a piercing intensity, his storm gray eyes never leaving her. You are not weak, he finally said, his voice low and filled with something Lyra couldn't quite read. You were trained to believe you were, but you are not. The question is whether you can unlearn it. The words hit her harder than she expected. Unlearn it? Could she? Could she forget the years of being ignored, of being cast aside as worthless? Could she believe, even for a moment, that she could change? I will never be like them, Lyra whispered, her voice thick with emotion. I will never be like the warriors of this place. Aric's lips curled into a small, amused smile. No, he said, his tone shifting to something more dangerous. You won't be like them. But that doesn't mean you won't be dangerous. Lyra's head snapped up to meet his gaze. His words were cryptic, but there was a fire in his eyes that sent a chill down her spine. He didn't want her to become like the other warriors. He wanted her to become something different, something more. But the question was, what? He continued, his voice sharp with purpose. You are not like them, and that is your strength. They fight with their fists and their brute force, but you will fight with your mind. Lyra frowned, confused. What does that even mean? Aric's gaze darkened, and for a moment Lyra could see a flicker of something deeper in him, something raw and unyielding. It means you will learn to use what you have. Not strength, but cunning. Not power, but precision. You are like a blade in the dark, quick, silent, deadly. The words unsettled her. A blade in the dark? Lyra had never seen herself as a weapon. She was just a discarded daughter. She had always been in the shadows, not part of the pack, not part of the world around her. How could she be a blade? But as Aric's eyes locked onto hers, she saw something in them, something that made her wonder if he truly saw her, not as the girl she had been, but as something more, something she could become. Come, Aric said, his voice a sharp command, pulling her from her thoughts. He stepped back, gesturing toward a wooden training dummy in the center of the room. You will strike it, not with power, with precision. Lyra's heart raced, but she moved toward the dummy nonetheless, the weight of the dagger in her hand feeling heavier than ever. She positioned herself as Aric had shown her, her feet steady on the ground, her grip tight but not too tight. Her breath slowed as she focused, trying to push aside the doubt that threatened to overwhelm her. Aric stood by, watching her closely, his eyes intense. Remember, you are not like them. You will not fight like them. Precision, Lyra. Precision. Lyra exhaled slowly, adjusting her stance. She raised the dagger, her focus solely on the dummy in front of her. Her mind raced. This is it. This is my chance. I can't fail. She took a deep breath and struck. The blade hit the dummy's chest with a sharp thud, but it didn't penetrate as she had hoped. She stepped back, her heart sinking. Aric didn't speak immediately, but his eyes studied the strike as if he were trying to find meaning in it. Then he spoke, his voice calm but firm. You missed. Not by much, but you missed. Lyra's stomach twisted. I missed. She looked down at the dummy, frustrated. Why can't I do this? She had the dagger, she had the skill, but it felt like something was missing. Something inside her wasn't aligning with the movements, the precision. Why couldn't she just do it? Aric stepped forward, his expression unchanged. Why did you miss? Lyra's voice faltered as she answered. I don't know. I don't know. Aric's gaze hardened. You missed because you hesitated. You doubted yourself. Lyra swallowed, trying to steady her breathing. She felt a rush of shame flood through her, and she dropped her eyes to the floor, unable to meet his gaze. Stop thinking, Aric said, his voice sharp. Stop thinking about what you can't do and focus on what you can. Your doubt is your weakness. Lyra's chest tightened. Doubt. It was something she had carried with her entire life. Doubt in her worth, doubt in her abilities. She had never been allowed to believe in herself. Aric continued, his words cutting through the silence. You will learn to fight with your mind. When you doubt, when you hesitate, you lose. Do not give them the satisfaction. Lyra looked up at him, her heart racing. His eyes were unwavering, his presence a force that left no room for weakness. I don't know if I can do this, Lyra whispered, her voice trembling. Aric's expression softened, just barely. You will do this, Lyra. It is not a question, it is your survival. The weight of his words settled over her like a blanket of steel. She was not here by choice, she was here because King Aric had seen something in her, and whether she wanted it or not, she would survive. He turned away, motioning to the dummy. Try again, but this time do not think, strike with intent. Lyra raised the dagger once more, taking a deep breath. She was no warrior, but she could learn to be something else, something more. With a swift motion, she struck again. This time, the blade sank into the dummy's chest with a satisfying thud. It wasn't perfect, but it was better. Aric nodded in approval, his eyes lingering on her. Good, you're learning. Lyra's heart swelled, a small flicker of pride igniting within her. She wasn't there yet, but she was getting closer. She was beginning to feel the fire within her, the fire she had never known existed. And for the first time since she arrived at the Iron Citadel, she felt something other than fear. She felt a spark of hope. Lyra's training in the Iron Citadel continued, each day blending into the next as sharp and unforgiving as the stones that surrounded her. Her progress was slow but steady. Each time she raised the dagger, each time she struck, she felt herself growing stronger, more capable. Aric had seen something in her, and for the first time in her life, Lyra began to believe in the possibility of becoming something more than just the broken daughter of Ashwood. But as the days passed, she felt a shift in the Citadel, an undercurrent of tension that grew heavier with every passing hour. The warriors, the betas, the alphas, everyone who lived in the Citadel seemed on edge. Whispers spread like wildfire, each rumor more ominous than the last. Aric, the Iron King, had conquered many lands, but the political landscape of the Lycan world was never as simple as one man's power. There were always those who would seek to dethrone the king, to challenge him, to tear down what he had built. Lyra could feel it in the air like the crackle before a storm. The question wasn't if it would happen, but when. The first sign came when she was summoned to the war room. She had just finished a brutal training session with Aric, her body sore and drenched in sweat, when a messenger arrived at her quarters. His face was grim, his eyes darting nervously as he handed her a slip of parchment. King Aric requests your presence, the messenger said, his voice shaking. Now. Lyra nodded, trying to suppress the unease creeping up her spine. She followed the messenger through the dark, winding corridors of the Citadel, her heart thudding in her chest. The closer they got to the war room, the more she could sense the weight of the situation. As they arrived at the door, the heavy oak frame seemed to close around her like a trap. The air was thick, stifling, and for a moment Lyra hesitated. She had learned to trust Aric, but there was something unsettling about the silence in the halls today. It felt like the calm before the storm. The messenger knocked twice, and the door creaked open, revealing the war room beyond. Inside, King Aric stood at the head of a large stone table, his back to her. His posture was tense, his shoulders rigid with a controlled fury that Lyra had never seen before. The room was filled with others, warriors, commanders, and alphas, each one eyeing her warily as she entered. Lyra's eyes darted from face to face, noting the silent tension in the room. Something was happening. Aric turned slowly, his eyes locking onto hers, a cold fire burning in their depths. Lyra, he said, his voice calm but dangerous, like the stillness before a fight. Come forward. She obeyed, stepping into the center of the room. Her pulse quickened as she took her place before Aric. She could feel the weight of the gazes on her, their intensity like a physical pressure. Aric gestured to the table where a large map of the territories lay. You've been training and you've learned quickly, he said, his voice still carrying that cold edge. But today you will learn something else. Lyra frowned, confused. What else? Before she could speak, Aric continued. There are traitors among us, those who seek to bring me down, to tear apart what I've built. They move in the shadows, speaking of rebellion, of overthrowing the king. A chill ran down her spine as she glanced at the faces around the table. The warriors, the alphas, their expressions were tight, suspicious. It was clear that there was more at play than just a training session. I've known this day was coming, Aric continued, his gaze never leaving Lyra. And I need someone who can see it coming, someone who can help root it out before it's too late. Lyra's breath caught in her throat. Me? He wanted her to help? She was just an Omega, an outsider in a world of warriors and alphas. Why me? Aric seemed to read her thoughts. You see what others do not, he said, his voice steady. Your mind is sharp, your instincts precise. You have the ability to notice the subtle shifts, the whispers that slip through the cracks. Lyra's heart raced as she absorbed his words. He wasn't asking her to fight, he was asking her to be something else, to be his eyes and ears in a world filled with secrets and lies. You will help me uncover the traitors, Aric said, his voice cold, final. The rebellion must be stopped before it takes root, and you, Lyra, are the key to finding it. Lyra stared at him, her mind reeling. She had never been part of this world. She was the daughter of a discarded alpha, a wolfless Omega who had been abandoned by her pack. How could she possibly be the one to help King Aric? But as she looked into his eyes, she saw something there, a trust, a belief in her that she had never felt from anyone before. It was as if, in this cold, ruthless world, Aric saw her not for what she had been, but for what she could become. He wasn't asking her to be a warrior. He was asking her to be his equal in a way that no one else could be. She would fight with her mind, with her cunning, with her ability to see the truth in the lies. "You will not be alone," Aric continued, his voice softer now. "I will have my most trusted warriors assist you, but you will lead this. You will find them before they can make their move." Lira swallowed hard, her stomach twisted with fear, but she nodded. "I'll do it." Aric's lips curled into a small, approving smile. "Good. We begin tonight." As the others in the room filed out, Lira stood there, still absorbing what had just transpired. She was no longer just an outsider, she was no longer the discarded daughter of Ashwood, she was a player in a game far bigger than she had ever imagined. And as the door closed behind the last of the warriors, Lira took a deep breath. The weight of what Aric had asked her to do settled over her like a blanket of stone. But there was no turning back now. The future she had once imagined was gone. In its place was a dangerous game of power, betrayal, and survival. And for the first time, Lira felt the flicker of something else, a spark deep inside her, a desire to prove that she was more than just the broken girl who had once been discarded. The Iron Citadel had always felt like a place where strength was the only currency. Aric ruled it with a hand of iron, and those who did not have the courage to seize power found themselves crushed beneath the weight of his presence. But as Lira navigated the treacherous halls and calculated her next move, she realized something. "I had no choice but to learn the game of power," she thought, "and now I will play it." Days had passed since King Aric had entrusted her with the task of uncovering the traitors. She had worked tirelessly, shadowing the warriors, listening to their whispers in the halls, watching their movements with a keen eye that Aric had somehow recognized. He had believed in her from the start when even she had doubted her own abilities. And now, more than ever, she had to prove that she was worthy of his trust. But the deeper she dug, the more complicated it became. The traitors were not the obvious ones. They weren't the brash, angry alphas who bellowed their discontent. No, they were the ones who hid behind smiles and pleasantries, the ones who blended in with the shadows. The whispers were subtle, the betrayal quiet, but it was there. It was during one of her nightly patrols that she caught a glimpse of something that made her blood run cold. She had been slipping through the corridors of the Citadel, her mind sharp, when she overheard voices coming from behind a door. She froze, pressing herself against the wall as the words floated through the crack in the door. "Aric thinks he controls everything," a voice hissed, the tone bitter. "But he's weak. He's surrounded by sycophants. We could overthrow him and take it all for ourselves." Lyra's heart skipped a beat. She knew that voice. It belonged to one of the commanders, Ulfri, a tall, powerful man who had served Aric loyally, or so she had thought. The other voice, lower and colder, replied, "You're right. Aric's rule won't last. We need to act soon. The time for subtlety is over. We strike before he has the chance to fortify his control." Lyra's mind raced as she listened. A coup. It was happening. The rebellion wasn't a rumor anymore. It was real. And Ulfri, one of Aric's closest allies, was at its heart. Her stomach twisted with a mix of fear and determination. This was what she had been training for. This was her moment to prove herself, to stand alongside Aric, not just as his tool, but as his partner. She couldn't let the traitors win. She couldn't let them destroy everything Aric had worked for, everything they had both built. But she knew that if she confronted them head-on, it would only make things worse. She had to be smarter. She had to be subtle. And most importantly, she had to act fast. The following night, she made her move. Lira stood before King Aric's throne, her heart pounding in her chest. It was time to tell him the truth, the whole truth. The air in the room was heavy with anticipation, the shadows cast by the torchlight stretching across the cold stone walls. Aric was seated, his usual imposing figure giving off an aura of control and power. His sharp eyes never left her as she approached. "You've discovered something," Aric said, his voice low and commanding. It wasn't a question, it was a statement. Lira nodded, swallowing hard. The weight of the knowledge she carried pressed down on her like a stone, but there was no turning back now. She had come this far. "I've overheard a conversation, Your Majesty," she began, her voice steady, though her insides were churning. "There's a plot to overthrow you. A group of traitors, including Ulfri, are planning to strike before you can secure your position." The room fell into a heavy silence. Aric didn't speak immediately. His gaze pierced her as if he were weighing the truth of her words, testing the sincerity of her claim. "You're sure?" he finally asked, his voice quiet but filled with an edge of steel. Lyra nodded again. "I'm sure. They plan to move quickly before you can act. They're already plotting their next move." Aric's eyes narrowed. For a moment, Lyra thought he might explode in anger, but instead he simply exhaled slowly as if taking in the weight of the situation. "This is what I expected," he said softly. "It was always going to happen. I knew it, but it's still disappointing." Lyra's heart twisted at his words. Disappointing? It wasn't disappointment she felt. It was a cold, calculating anger that she hadn't expected to see from Aric. He wasn't just a king, he was a Lycan who had seen betrayal countless times, and this was just another day for him. "But you've uncovered it," he continued, his voice now filled with a quiet intensity. "And that's all that matters. We'll deal with them." Lyra felt a sense of relief wash over her, but it was brief. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper. Aric leaned forward in his seat, his storm gray eyes locked onto hers. "Now," he said, "we turn the tables." Lyra felt a rush of adrenaline course through her veins. Turn the tables? What did he mean by that? "You've done well, Lyra," Aric said, standing up, "but now you will need to be more than just an observer. You're going to help me dismantle this rebellion. You're going to be part of this way, not as my servant, but as my equal." Lyra's eyes widened. Equal? She had never thought of herself that way, not in the world of the Citadel, not in the world of power and violence. But here, in Aric's gaze, there was something that made her feel like she could truly be more. "How?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Aric's lips curled into a small, deadly smile. "We'll bait them. They think they can strike before I'm prepared. They think they can tear down everything I've built, but they underestimate us. They underestimate you." Lyra's heart pounded harder. Bait them? This was no longer just about surviving, this was about taking control of the situation, turning her position into one of power, but it was also dangerous, the stakes had just become much higher. "Get ready," Aric said, his voice firm. "We strike tomorrow." Lyra nodded, the realization of what she had just agreed to settling over her like a heavy cloak. This wasn't just about King Aric anymore, this was about her ability to fight, to act, to survive. She wasn't just the discarded daughter of Ashwood anymore. She was more than that. She was Lyra, the woman who had the power to change everything, and she would prove it. The Citadel was alive with movement. The usual solemn stillness of its stone halls had been replaced by a frenetic energy. The traitors had been exposed, their rebellion unraveling like a tightly wound thread. King Aric had wasted no time. The air was thick with tension as the warriors, commanders, and servants prepared for the inevitable clash. Lyra moved through the Citadel, her thoughts racing. This was the moment she had been training for. She had stood by Aric's side for so long, learning from him, adapting to his ruthless world, but now she was about to step into the heart of the storm. The Iron King had commanded her to be part of this battle, not as a pawn, but as a partner. She would not sit on the sidelines and watch. She would be the weapon. She would be the one to tip the scales. As the sound of distant footsteps echoed through the hall, Lyra took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. What had she become? The girl who had once cowered in the shadows of Ashwood, the girl who had been discarded by her family, was now standing on the precipice of a new future. But it wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about power. It was about her place in this world. The great hall loomed ahead, its massive doors closed, guarding the fate of the Citadel. The traitors, those who had once been Aric's trusted allies, were gathered within. Ulfri, the traitor who had once stood by Aric's side, now stood at the center of the room with a few of his most loyal followers. His eyes flickered with anger as he glared at the door, unaware of what was coming. Lyra's heart pounded in her chest as she stepped forward, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts. This is it, she thought. This is where everything changes. As the door to the hall swung open with a deafening creak, a hush fell over the room. All eyes turned to Lyra, standing at the threshold. The traitors' gazes were filled with contempt, disbelief, and something else, something darker. They had expected Aric to crush them with force, to wipe them out in one swift strike. But they hadn't expected her. King Aric stood beside her, his presence unwavering. The traitors' eyes flickered between the two of them, their disbelief growing, but it was more than that, there was fear in their gaze. Aric had claimed Lyra as his equal. She was no longer just the discarded daughter of Ashwood. She was a force to be reckoned with. "You've made a mistake," Aric's voice echoed through the hall, cold and final. "A fatal one." Ulfri sneered, but his eyes betrayed him. There was doubt now, creeping into the edges of his expression. You think you can stop us? He spat. You think you can just claim her and make it all go away? Aric's lips curled into a dangerous smile. You'll find out what happens when you underestimate me, and you'll find out what happens when you underestimate her. He turned slightly, his eyes shifting to Lira. She's no longer the girl you thought you could manipulate. She is mine. And she will be the end of you. Lira stepped forward, her gaze fixed on Ulfri. She could feel the weight of Aric's words behind her. This wasn't just about defeating the traitors, this was about proving that she too was a force to be reckoned with. She had spent her entire life in the shadows, waiting for someone to notice her, to see her. But now, standing beside Aric, she had the power to show the world who she really was. I'm not your tool, Lira said, her voice steady, her grip on the dagger tight. And I'm not your weak daughter. You failed me when you thought I was nothing. Now you will see what happens when I fight back. The room fell silent, Ulfri's face twisted with fury as he took a step forward. You think you can stop this? He sneered. You think you can turn the tide? We outnumber you, we are stronger, and we have the support of others. Lyra's heart raced, but her stance was unwavering. She could feel Aric's presence behind her, his strength flowing through her like a current. She wasn't alone in this, she had Aric's trust and she had the power of her own resolve. It was time to show the world what she could do. With a swift motion, she raised her dagger, the blade catching the light of the torches. The traitors flinched, their eyes wide with uncertainty. Aric stepped forward, his gaze never leaving Lira. You've underestimated her, and now you will see just how wrong you were. The silence that followed was thick with anticipation. Lira felt the weight of the moment press down on her, but she didn't falter. She had trained for this one moment of confrontation. She wasn't just Aric's equal in name, she was his equal in purpose. Ulfri stepped forward, his hand going to the hilt of his own dagger, his expression dark with fury. But before he could make a move, Aric spoke, his voice cold and commanding. Enough, Aric said, his voice carrying the full weight of his authority. This rebellion ends now. The room erupted into chaos as Aric's warriors flooded in, taking positions around the traitors. But Lira didn't move. She didn't need to. This was Aric's world. She was here to make sure it stayed his. She stood tall, her dagger raised, her eyes locked on Ulfri. The traitors might have thought they could take down the king, but they hadn't counted on her, on the girl they had cast aside, the girl they had dismissed as weak. She wasn't weak anymore. She was a weapon, a force in her own right. Aric moved to her side, his presence like a wall, unyielding and steady. You have no allies, he said to the traitors, his voice final. You will not win. Ulfri's face twisted with rage, but there was fear in his eyes now. His confidence was crumbling, his plans falling apart around him. You think this is over? He snarled. You think you can stop us? Aric took a step forward, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. Yes, this is over. You are nothing more than traitors, and today you will pay the price. The words hit like a hammer. The traitors froze, their plans shattered, their courage failing. They were done. And so was their rebellion. Lyra's heart pounded in her chest, the adrenaline coursing through her veins. She wasn't just the girl they had once discarded, she was Lira, the queen in the making. And the world would finally see her for who she truly was. If you think Lira deserves to rise above her past and take her place beside Aric, don't miss the next chapter. Hit subscribe and join her journey where power, betrayal, and survival intertwine. Let's prove that those who are cast aside can rise again. If you believe strength comes from within, drop a comment and say, I stand with Lira and show the world you're not afraid to fight for what's yours.